this is the slide that we left off on yesterday with the definition of what exocrine, endocrine hormones and target tissue were. The idea here is not that I'm going to ask you on a test what's the definition of a hormone, but we're going to spend the next several days talking about different endocrine glands, different hormones, and different target tissues. So you need to know what they are so that you know what we're talking about. Now, there are a couple of types of hormones. I've given a little description, and then I put a picture because I like to point at things, but I want to emphasize you will not be asked at any point to draw those pictures. It's a little bit beyond the scope of our course, but I like to have something to point at. Hormones can be divided into two big groups based on their physical properties. Some of the hormones that we'll discuss are protein hormones. So it's a hormone, but it's made out of a protein. The reason it's a hormone, it's getting secreted by a gland into the blood, it's going to have an effect on a target organ. That's why we call it a hormone. Protein hormones, when they're going to have their effect, attach to something outside the membrane of the cell, and then that causes a sequence of events to happen inside the cell, usually involving an enzyme that's going to be activated. Now, which enzyme is it differs depending on the hormone. But for example, insulin is a protein hormone. It would fall in this category. So when insulin is having its effect, it's going to attach to a receptor on the outside of the cell. It's not actually going to go into the cell. And then it's going to cause a sequence of chemical reactions catalyzed by an enzyme. Another category of hormones are called steroid hormones. Most of the hormones that are steroid hormones we won't discuss until we discuss reproduction. Most of the reproductive hormones are steroid hormones. It's probably the context in which you've heard the word steroid before. It probably has a negative connotation for a lot of you. That guy's taking steroids. That's probably a sentence that you've heard people utter. But something being a steroid hormone doesn't make it innately bad. That's how lots of your hormones naturally work. These hormones are liposoluble, so they can go through the cell membrane, which means instead of attaching to a receptor outside, they can go right inside the cell. And then typically these types of hormones end up causing protein synthesis. How does protein synthesis work? DNA gets transcribed to mRNA. mRNA gets translated into a protein. We'll review that on our little review cards in a few days. So like I said, no one's going to ask you to draw these pictures, but these are two different ways that hormones can affect their target tissue or target cell. Either they bind to a receptor outside on the cell membrane, or they go through the cell membrane and then have their effect inside the cell. Now, we need to take a look at principal endocrine glands. Now, normally I would write on this page, and I'm not super confident that it's going to work on the smartboard as is. So I'm going to write things on the whiteboard kind of adjacent to it and just say what it is I'm doing. Yeah, you know what? I just need a little bit of space right here. Now, this picture is on that hormone table that I gave you yesterday. So if you're not someone who prints the whole notes package out yourself, you have this picture. You just have to look at that hormone table. So if you were to label these lines in order, and that's what I'll do, I'll start at the very top one and go down. The one at the top is pointing to the hypothalamus. Now, I recognize that the ones that are pointing to structures in the brain are a little hard to see here because it's tiny compared to the rest of the picture. But if you'll recall, the hypothalamus is below and in front of the thalamus, and it's attached to the pituitary gland, which is how I told you all to locate it when we did our brain dissection. Number 2 is the pineal gland. And number 3 is the pituitary gland. Now, in terms of the hypothalamus, it produces quite a few things. For some reason in Biology 30, they don't require that you know the names of the hormones that come from the hypothalamus. They call them releasing factors as a general group. But you'll see that we'll talk about the hypothalamus quite repetitively because it's part of the pathway for a lot of hormone production. The pineal gland we'll see because it's where melatonin is coming from. And so when we get to the slide about melatonin, we'll see it here. The pituitary gland, really I should say pituitary glands, because there are 2 parts to it, produce a ton of stuff. They in fact get their own slide on the next slide, so I'm not going to list everything they do here. The 4th one are the parathyroid glands. Now, if you take a look at this picture here, it kind of looks like the 4th and 5th line are pointing at the same sort of structure. The parathyroid glands are these 4 little dots, essentially, that are on the thyroid gland. Now, I think it looks like a bow tie, and then those are the polka dots on the bow tie. The way I drew it, it actually kind of looks like a gaming controller thing. But the parathyroid glands are these 4 small little dots that are on the other gland. Number 5 is the thyroid gland. And so if you look, here's line 4, here's line 5. Line 5 is pointing directly at the thyroid, which is the bow tie shaped structure. And the little dots are the parathyroid glands. Now underneath, the 6th line isn't really an endocrine structure, but I'm telling you what it is because it's in the picture. This is your thymus. It has more to do with your immune system than anything, and it's not one that I'm asking you to know. I'm just telling you because it's in this picture. The next line after thymus is the liver. The liver itself is not a gland that's producing hormones, but it is the target tissue of several hormones, and so it's important to know where it is located. The next line down is pointing to one of the 2 adrenal glands. So it's pointing just to the one on the left side of the picture, but I hope you can see there's the same structure on top of the kidney on the other side of the picture. So that's your 6th endocrine gland, your adrenal glands. Following the adrenal glands, there's a line here that's pointed at the kidneys. It's not producing a hormone, but it is the target tissue of some hormones, and so that's why we want you to be able to identify it. The 7th gland underneath that is the pancreas. So the pancreas is this yellow structure on this picture. Kind of looks like a wing in this picture. The pancreas I'm sure you've heard of before because we talk about it in Bio20 in the digestion unit. Now the structures that you see below, those are reproductive structures, and so I'm showing you them now because of course they're endocrine glands, they're making hormones. But we're not going to get a ton into the details of those hormones until we get to the section on reproduction. So this next line here is pointing at one of the 2 ovaries. So 8 are the ovaries. Number 9, if you take a look, it's pointing at the inner lining of the uterus, which is where the placenta would develop. And so number 9 is the placenta. That's only during pregnancy, and of course we'll talk about the details of that one a bit later on. And then the very last one, testes. So like I said yesterday, this is a generic person who has all the reproductive organs, so no specific gender here, biologically speaking. Just a generic human form that has all the endocrine glands that we are going to talk about. Now, if you have some questions you'd like to ask, or you need me to clarify what a line is pointing at, please ask. So, super realistic that you will have to identify things on a picture. This many things at one time, unlikely. You know that numeric response questions tend to have 4 lines in them. So I would say most pictures where you have to identify structures have at least 4 things on them. Sometimes they'll include a 5th or a 6th, so you really have to pick and choose the correct ones. But certainly not 10 plus some extra pieces that aren't endocrine glands. That would be too many things for you to label at once. Now if I go back to the notes, so if you've switched to that page with the picture, you might want to go back to the notes now. We need to talk about the pituitary glands a little bit more specifically. If I look at the pituitary, it's this little dangling structure. It's attached to the hypothalamus. We knew that from before when we talked about the structure of the brain. But there are actually 2 lobes to the pituitary glands. So this is an endocrine gland, consists of 2 lobes. It's in a bony cavity attached by a thin rod to the hypothalamus. So if we look at a brain, the pituitary glands are below and in front of the hypothalamus, and we've seen that on a picture of a brain before. Sometimes this is called the master gland because it releases a bunch of stimulants. What we'll see is that most of the hormones that the pituitary glands are releasing stimulate other hormones to be produced. So they're not maybe directly affecting a target tissue, but rather they're making another hormone be produced, which can then go and have an effect. The posterior lobe, and so if you look at the picture, here's the posterior one. Posterior doesn't mean right, it means back. And so if I was to look at a brain, the anterior lobe would be at the front, posterior lobe would be at the back. So posterior lobe produces no hormone. Okay? It's not making the hormone. If I could underline things, I would underline the word produce because that's the key. It's not producing the hormone, but it is storing and releasing 2 hormones. ADH is one of them. Anyone remember what ADH is from Bio30? Yeah? You're thinking of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. The A stands for anti in ADH, and the H stands for hormone. Anyone remember this one? Has to do with your kidneys, your bladder, peeing. Still nobody? So ADH is antidiuretic hormone. It's the hormone that's produced, and now you know it's produced in the hypothalamus, but stored and released by the posterior lobe of the pituitary. And we'll see in just a minute, because I got another slide about ADH. It's the one that will tell your kidneys it's time to retain water. There's another hormone, oxytocin. This is a reproductive hormone that we'll talk about in more detail later on. But these 2 hormones are stored and released from the posterior lobe, even though they're produced in the hypothalamus. The other thing that's key, and I would underline this if I was sure the smartboard would work, I would underline transferred by neurons. That's how they get there. The posterior lobe of the pituitary gland is not connected to the hypothalamus by a blood vessel. It's connected by a neuron. So the neuron is going to transport those 2 substances to the posterior pituitary. The anterior lobe, now anterior doesn't mean left, it means front. So if I'm looking at a brain, the lobe on the front will be anterior. Produces lots of hormones. And in this case, it does produce them. It's not getting them and storing them from somewhere else. And then there's a network of blood vessels. I would underline blood vessels because that's different. The posterior lobe is connected by neurons, but the anterior one connected by blood vessels. It's called the portal system. and it carries the hormones that are released by the hypothalamus. I don't know what that is. That must have been me writing in French first and English second. That makes no sense. The hormones that are released by the hypothalamus, not hormones that release the hypothalamus. That's gibberish. So we have those pituitary glands. Anterior, posterior, front and back. Anterior is connected by blood to the hypothalamus. Posterior is connected by neurons to the hypothalamus. Now, I didn't mention which hormones are coming from the anterior lobe, because there are lots of them. And here they are. There are, if you look on the internet, multiple mnemonics that you could use to remember these anterior pituitary hormones. Here's mine. Think of bacon. Maybe you don't like bacon, but if you do, it's delicious. And what's bacon? It's flat pig. So, flat pig. The M, F, L, A, T, P, not the I, but the G, all represent one of the hormones that's coming from the anterior pituitary. There is MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. That's the M. FSH, follicle stimulating hormone. LH, luteinizing hormone. ACTH, adrenocorticotropic hormone. TSH, it's the T, thyroid stimulating hormone. PRL, it's the P, prolactin. The I is ignore, simply because there weren't enough vowels to make real sounding words. And the G stands for GH, growth hormone. Now you're probably like, oh man, how am I going to remember all these ridiculous sounding names? Well, we're going to learn about them, and hopefully the names make more sense. But you also have data sheets. You probably haven't looked at them in a while because they really weren't practical or useful in the last section that we did. But on your data sheet, one of the things that there is a table. It's right above the pedigree information, and it says abbreviations for some hormones. Of all of these hormones that are here, MSH is the only one that's not on that table. All of the other ones have the abbreviation and the full name of the hormone. So do not be alarmed. You could always look up what the full name of the hormone is. It's pretty standard for us to just use the abbreviations because they're on your data table. But if you ever needed to know the full name, sometimes it's useful because it tells you what it does. So for example, melanocyte stimulating hormone, well, that's what it does. It stimulates melanocytes. Well, this one stimulates follicles. Oh, this one stimulates the thyroid. So sometimes the abbreviation might not clue you in, but if you look up the full name, you're like, oh, that's what that hormone does. Its name specifically is telling me what it does. Now, if you have questions that you would like to ask, I would like to answer them. Okay, you can use your own mnemonic. This is just the one that works for me. I like bacon. Now, we are going to talk about how these hormones work. Right, so right now I'm just telling you these are the ones that come from the anterior pituitary, but we're going to have lessons about each of them. Some of them, specifically FSH, LH, and prolactin, those are more reproductive type hormones, so we're not going to get into the details until a bit later on, but we know that this is where they come from. We're going to focus on ACTH, TSH, and growth hormone. Those will be our big ones. I will talk about MSH, but there's honestly quite a bit less detail about that one than there are about the others. Now, another thing that comes up frequently when we talk about hormones is the idea of a negative feedback loop. Negative feedback, if we take a look at the two words, first it has negative. That implies we're stopping, we're shutting off, we're reducing, we're preventing. And then feedback tells us that something is going to go back to where it came from or back to the beginning. So if I put it together, my negative feedback loop in the context of hormones is talking about when the output of the system, so the thing that's being produced, suppresses or inhibits the activity of the system. So in a lot of cases with hormones, we have this sequence of steps. First this happens, then the hormone is produced. Once that happens, we have to have a way to shut the system off so we don't have overproduction of hormones. So in the case of hormones, when there's a certain concentration of a hormone in the blood, then the endocrine gland that releases the hormone ends up being inhibited. It's a good sort of fail-safe so that your body doesn't overproduce substances that it doesn't need to produce. Now this is a generic feedback loop, very general. But I'm going to use this to talk about ADH for two reasons. One, you need to know how ADH works. Two, you should have already heard about ADH, so it should be moderately familiar to you. And if it's not, well, this is me reminding you. Now, the generic pathway I have here isn't for every single hormone that exists, but for many of the hormones we'll discuss, the hypothalamus will be the beginning point. Something will happen in the hypothalamus. Then another gland will be affected, and then either another gland or the target tissue will be affected after that. That's a pretty generic pathway, okay? So in the case of ADH, the hypothalamus is where things start. ADH is produced in the hypothalamus. So if I could write on the smartboard, on this arrow, I would write ADH. It's produced there. Gland 1 would then become the pituitary gland, specifically the posterior pituitary, like we saw previously. So gland 1 would be the posterior pituitary. What is the posterior pituitary releasing? Well, ADH. So in this example specifically, ADH is going from the hypothalamus to gland 1, and then ADH is what's being released from gland 1. That's because in this particular scenario, it's produced in the hypothalamus, but released by the posterior pituitary. Now, if I follow this along, gland 2, or the target tissue for ADH, is going to be the kidney, specifically the nephron, but the kidney should be enough for you to know at this point. In the kidney, if you recall what happens in your kidneys, things go from your blood to the filtrate or vice versa. So your blood gets filtered, and then your body will take back some things and then put more things into the filtrate that becomes your urine. ADH's job is to increase water reabsorption. So on this last arrow, I'm not going to get another hormone, I'm going to get the effect. Water is reabsorbed. That's what happens. When this occurs, when water is reabsorbed, well then the thing that was causing your body to produce ADH has been taken care of. You've reabsorbed water. You're no longer low on water. Your blood pressure has gone back up. These are some of the reasons that your body would produce ADH in the first place. So we have these little arrows, and if I could write on the smartboard, I would put little negatives at the end of the arrows, indicating that they're feeding back negatively. Once water has been reabsorbed, that tells my posterior pituitary, stop releasing it. And it tells my hypothalamus, stop making it. We're good. We don't need any more ADH. Now, so for the next 3 lessons, we're going to focus on some specific physiological effects that these hormones cause. And we'll show you how they relate to hormones that come from the hypothalamus, the pituitary, and sometimes no hypothalamus and pituitary at all. That'll be at least for a couple of the scenarios. But if you look, we're going to look at growth and metabolism. Then tomorrow and Monday, we're going to look at calcium and stress. Then we're going to look at blood sugar. So we're going to look at physiological events and how hormones play a role in what happens. And then when we move to the next section, we'll talk about reproduction. So not just babies, but puberty as well, and how hormones play a role in all of those processes. So the first one we'll take a look at is melatonin. Melatonin is one that I find people know lots about because it's readily available. It's something you can buy at the grocery store, the pharmacy. Like, it's not regulated. You don't need a prescription or anything. But melatonin is a hormone that's involved in the regulation of sleep cycles. In other words, your circadian rhythm, when you're awake and when you're asleep. Now, if you have if you're familiar with melatonin, like you've used it or you know somebody who uses it, could you just raise your hand? Yeah, usually lots of people are familiar with this. So melatonin, the way that it works is that its production is inhibited when the retina detects light. So link back to the eye. The retina is detecting light, then the production of melatonin is inhibited. And it's stimulated in the absence of light. So when it's dark, your body makes melatonin. When it's light, it doesn't. Melatonin generation is by the pineal gland. So that's one of those 3 structures in the brain that we highlighted before. It peaks during nighttime hours, right? When it's dark, when there's no light coming in. And it induces physiological changes that promote sleep. For example, slight decrease in body temperature, slight change in respiration rate. Not a huge difference. You wouldn't even probably notice it if you were aware of it happening, but enough that it promotes sleep. So sometimes people might make use of melatonin to help correct their sleep, especially if they've traveled somewhere where the time zone is different. So maybe some of you have experienced jet lag before, where you travel on a plane and now when you left it was nighttime, when you get there it's the morning, and everything's all messed up and your sleep pattern is messed up and it's hard to get back on track. That might be a reason that someone would take a melatonin supplement. You can buy them, they come in different things, but I have some ones that are like chocolate mint flavored, and they just dissolve on your tongue. As far as we know, there's not a ton of side effects that come from melatonin, but of course, used as directed. Anything overused can probably cause harm. Sorry, I should pause there. Anyone want to ask questions about melatonin? Okay. So melatonin has to do with sleeping, comes from the pineal gland. The reason I grouped melatonin with growth and metabolism is because sleep is really essential for growth. If you don't get the correct amount of sleep, growth doesn't happen properly, and really nothing functions. And so sleep is essential to the function of basically everything else that you have. Lots of other things happen while you're sleeping, but it's the time when your body gets the rest that it needs, and so sleep is crucial. Also, I've been trying to get you guys to think about how much you're sleeping and to try to sleep more. Yeah?
I go to bed at like 12:30 and I wake up at 7:30. Is that good?
I mean, the recommended amount of sleep for adults, which you're close to being, is in the 7 hour per night range. So I would say you could maybe use a bit more, especially at your age, but always go with what your body is telling you, right? Some people just need less sleep. They can get by on 6 hours of sleep and they feel fine. But if you constantly feel exhausted, then that's your body telling you that you're not getting enough sleep.
Can I tell you a little something I discovered?
Yeah.
That, because I've read a lot about sleep, because it's my favorite thing.
Mm-hmm.
There's different parts to sleep cycle.
Oh, yeah.
And melatonin speeds up your REM sleep, which is why if you've ever noticed taking melatonin,
Dreams
are out of control.
Insane.
You might wake up not feeling rested because it didn't help with deep sleep.
Yeah, if you have, I know on my tracker, it tracks my sleep, and then on my Fitbit app, it tells me how much time I spent in REM and light and deep sleep, and it tracks it, and then it gives me like a score, like how good I slept the night before. And I always get the best scores when I have lots of deep sleep. And she's right, melatonin is not good for that. So if you're using melatonin to help you get better sleep, this is probably not going to happen. But like I was saying, sometimes melatonin could be useful to help you get back on the correct pattern for sleep, because it'll make you tired at the right time.
Yep.
Anybody else want to ask anything there about sleeping and melatonin? Okay. So, regulation of growth is the next idea. So first we had sleep, now we have growth. We're going to focus on what the anterior pituitary does to help regulate growth. Now what it does is that it regulates growth, development, and metabolism in a number of ways, but first, through the production and secretion of human growth hormone. Now, I'm calling this one human growth hormone, HGH. Sometimes you'll see it referred to, especially in older questions, as just GH, growth hormone. Lots of organisms have growth hormone, and so to specify in particular that it's the human version of this hormone we're talking about, we got the little h there. Sometimes you'll see the little lowercase h, sometimes you won't. Sometimes it'll just say GH. And just please be aware we're talking about the same thing. It's not a trick to try to fool you into thinking this is some mysterious other hormone. Same one, same thing. HGH, unlike a lot of the other hormones we'll talk about, acts on basically all the tissues of your body. So what's its target tissue? Kind of everything, okay? Now if I had to pick some particular parts, one of the structures that HGH stimulates in particular is the liver. So even though it stimulates all your tissues, if I had to pick one, like liver is a good example of something specific. In your liver, there are growth factors that are stimulated. They help increase protein synthesis. So make more proteins. Why? That's what stuff is made out of. Proteins are the building blocks. If I want to make more cells or make more structures, I need to make more proteins. It increases cell division and cell growth. Well, that makes sense because if I want the organism to get bigger, there's a limit to how big cells can get, so I also need cell division to make more cells. It also stimulates an increase in breakdown and metabolic release of fats. So breaking down fat, getting energy from that. All of those things could help an organism grow because it's going to help their cells grow and multiply. Now, HGH stimulates the growth of muscles, connective tissue, and cartilage plates at the end of bones, which causes them to elongate and stretch. So bones are another thing that growth hormone specifically affects. Yeah, it affects your whole body, but your bones are specifically affected by this, and it's one of the reasons that they can continue to be longer. There are a couple of other hormones that act on your bones in different ways, but growth hormone is the one that's causing them to get longer, which would explain how people get taller. So this is what growth hormone, which is produced by the anterior pituitary, does. For most of the hormones, we're also going to talk about the pathway that they're part of. What stimulates them to be produced? What is their negative feedback loop? How does that work? And so that's what my next slide is about. So if I consider the control, how is this hormone managed? How does your body know to make it or to not make it? We start with the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is the beginning point for basically everything. There is a releasing hormone called growth hormone releasing hormone. You don't actually have to know the name of this hormone. If you look in the Bio30 curriculum, it's not there. But I think it's silly to not tell you that it's called growth hormone releasing hormone. Most hypothalamus releasing factors are just named for the hormone that they stimulate. In some questions, especially in that booklet I gave you of exemplars, they'll just call them releasing hormones. And sometimes I detest that generic terminology because then you're like, what are we really talking about? So there are some hormones. One of them is called growth hormone releasing hormone. The other is called growth hormone inhibiting hormone. These two hormones will either cause GH to be produced or reduce its production. And they're affected by many physiological stimulators: exercise, nutrition, sleep, other inhibitors, like how many free fatty acids there are. But these are the things that could affect these hypothalamus hormones, which will in turn affect whether growth hormone is produced or not. Now, if you have questions you would like to ask about growth hormone, or how it's controlled, what effects it has, please ask. If you read I've told you the things that are on your table. Where is it produced? Which endocrine gland? What's the name of the hormone? What effects does it have? Like, what's its target, and what does it do to the target tissue? And then the thing the table doesn't have, but that I'm going to tell you for all these hormones, is how they're controlled. What stimulates them to be produced, or what thing shuts off their production so that you don't have too much. Now the last thing we'll look at, I think today, is a few examples of disorders. Like with nervous system disorders or vision disorders or hearing disorders, no one expects that you know the names of every disorder that ever existed in the history of time. What we would expect is that if I told you the symptoms of the disorder, right, I gave you some context, that you could tell me which hormone was being affected. And so I'm going to give you some examples of commonly discussed disorders so that hopefully when you get asked a question about them, even though there's a context telling you what it is, it's familiar to you. The first disorder I'll mention is gigantism. Gigantism is caused by excessive growth hormone secretion during childhood. You'll notice I wrote underneath there hypersecretion. Hyper means more than. You'll hopefully remember that from previous science courses, just like hypo means less than. So if a person's body is producing excessive growth hormone during childhood, gigantism could be the result. This is a picture of Robert Wadlow. I think he's still the tallest man in the Guinness Book of World Records, but maybe there's someone that's replaced him. In any case, he's very tall. Why would a person produce excess growth hormone? Could be a tumor in the gland. That's often a reason that there's excess being produced. But it makes the person be really, really, really tall because it causes their bones to continue to elongate maybe more or longer than they should. Next example of a disorder is called pituitary dwarfism, specifically because there's other reasons that dwarfism could occur. This one is caused by insufficient secretion during childhood. So if a person's body does not produce enough growth hormone, then pituitary dwarfism could occur. That would result in something like Tywin Lannister or Tyrion Lannister, the guy from Game of Thrones. Man, that was a good character, funny guy. But short limbs, because bones are not elongating the way that they should. And then the last one is acromegaly. This is a disorder where in an adult, there is excess growth hormone. Now here's the issue. In an adult, bones have usually stopped growing. They can't elongate any larger. And so all this growth hormone isn't going to make the person necessarily taller, but soft tissue like the feet and the hands and the face can enlarge. And that is what you will see as a symptom. Rather than excess height, you'll see soft tissue, face, hands, feet enlarging.